Okay, in this section we're going to look at muscle activity, the neuromuscular junction, that's NMJ, neuromuscular junction, the motor unit, contraction. In this section I have posted some videos from YouTube that explain in really good 3D animations how this works. I highly recommend that you take a look at those, as this is tough to talk about. As you know, a picture paints 1,000 words and a video paints 10,000 words. So please take the time to watch the videos that I've posted. They will correspond with what I'm going to talk about in these next slides. Okay, so bottom line is the nervous system must communicate to our muscle system in order for it to work. We need the irritability, which is the ability to receive and respond to a stimulus. We need the contractility, which is the ability to shorten when an adequate stimulus is received. Okay, now this is setting you up for the action potential that we'll talk about soon. Okay, we also need nerve stimulation, and this area is going to be the motor neuron. Okay, so write down the word motor and write down the word sensory. Alright, so our body, our nervous system, we have sensory input and motor output. Things that we sense and some sort of movement response. Okay, which we'll say motor or movement. Okay, so depending on the particular muscle, now MM is muscle, and the work that it does is going to depend on how much is stimulated. Okay, so for example, if you're writing with your hand, the muscles in your hand, they're doing a certain amount of work versus, let's say you were squatting 200 pounds. Okay, your legs and all your body muscles is doing a different type of work because of the nature. Writing with a pencil versus doing squats with 200 pounds. Okay, so as a result, our body knows how much to recruit in order to simply write or to lift something heavy. One neuron and all the skeletal muscle that it stimulates is called a motor unit. So these motor units are going to be recruited depending on the need at the time. How light or how heavy the movement or the things, or delicate the details, like calligraphy, art, painting versus football. Okay, as you can imagine, those are different activities. And our bodies know how much to use, the correct dose, shall we say, for the activity. Okay, it does that through our motor units. So here we have a cross section of the spinal cord, and we'll talk about nervous system stuff later when we get to that system. But for right now, this is a cross section of the spinal cord, and here we have the gray matter inside of the spinal cord. And here we have motor neurons and motor nerves. Okay, so they're going to come out of the spinal cord, and then innervate the actual muscle fibers. And then over here, this is what it looks like under a microscope. We have the axon terminals at the neuromuscular junction. Okay, now this is a fancy word, but let's break it down. Neuro, there's your nerve, innervates the muscular junction where they connect. The NMJ, or neuromuscular junction. Okay, a motor unit consists of a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it activates. The extension of the neuron called a nerve fiber or axon, when it reaches a muscle, it branches into a number of axon terminals. Okay, so you're seeing that right here. So this is the end, or the terminal end of the axon, so they just simply call it the axon terminal. And this one is just simply showing you branches into 3, innervating the muscle here. Okay, now we're going to zoom in. So this section here, we're going to zoom in tight. Okay, now there's some parts on this I want you to know. First, this yellow bulb is the axon terminal. Okay, so we're just going to call that AT for now, axon terminal. This space that you see here, that is the synaptic cleft. That is the gap between the axon terminal and the muscle. Okay. I also want you to know that this area is the pre-synapse or presynaptic membrane, and this down here is the post-synaptic membrane. Okay, so pre means before, post means after. So a nerve signal is going to come down to the axon terminal. So this is the pre stuff. It's going to stimulate these neurotransmitters to go across the synaptic cleft and hit the postsynaptic membrane. In this case, it's a muscle. When that happens, we're going to get muscle activity. Okay, here's another animation of basically the same thing. Here we have a muscle fiber, and here's your axon that goes into the axon terminal. And it's showing you the presynapse. There's an AKA, presynaptic terminal. Okay, if we zoom in tight, here's the presynaptic membrane or presynaptic terminal, the synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic membrane. Inside we have synaptic vesicles, and inside those vesicles are neurotransmitters. Depending on the nerve signal, depends on what type of neurotransmitter is released. Okay, with the neuromuscular junction, when a nerve impulse reaches the axon terminal, a neurotransmitter is released. Okay, a neurotransmitter, we have an example here, the NT or neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, we have different types of neurotransmitters. I'm introducing one of them to you right now, and that is the acetylcholine or ACH. When stimulated, it will diffuse across that synaptic cleft and reach receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. If enough acetylcholine is released, the sarcolemma becomes more permeable to the sodium ions. Okay, so eventually we're going to talk about sodium and potassium, which helps with muscle contraction. So sodium rushes in and potassium will leave. Okay, now let me pause for a second to remind you, watch the videos that I posted on action potential. It will help you tremendously on this concept. It's to some degree difficult to grasp just talking about it like this, but once you see that video, you will own the material. Okay, so when you get a chance, watch the video. Sodium will enter, potassium will leave. This changes the membrane potential, which allows for an action potential. Once this action potential is started, it cannot be stopped. So it's an all or nothing phenomenon, and the video will show you that. There's certain segments that talk about this all or none. And then it will travel over the entire surface of the sarcolemma. And the result is a muscle contraction. Okay, acetylcholine, which began this process, remember this is a neurotransmitter, is now broken down. Okay, so it's been used, it's been sent across the synaptic cleft, it's done its job, it's hit the receptors. It is now broken down into its acetic acid and choline components by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Okay, this word here, ACE, any word that ends in ACE is letting you know it is an enzyme. And remember, an enzyme is a catalyst, which means it speeds up a reaction. Okay, now because of this, only a single nerve impulse will make only one contraction. And this way the muscle will not contract over and over and over again. There's a refractory period that takes place. And that is designed to protect you. That is designed to help smoothen out the muscle contraction. So things like Parkinson's and myasthenia gravis, botulism, other problems with synaptic cleft and muscles and acetylcholine and neurotransmitter problems. That's why people can have weird and awkward movements like shakes and resting tremors and intention tremors, and it kind of looks like they're walking funny or moving funny because the muscles are not coordinated and they doesn't have that smooth action potential that covers the entire surface of the sarcolemma with a refractory period and all that. Okay, so there are some conditions and disorders and diseases that messes with this system. Okay, now here's they're zooming into the acetylcholine that's being released across the synaptic cleft and hitting the postsynaptic membrane receptor. When this happens, it allows the sodium-potassium channels to open, so the permeability now changes. And again, the videos that I've posted on this show you that. Shows you the animation of how this works, and so it'll make it more clear on the mechanisms of this. So here's your phenomenon. When enough electrical signal comes down, it will travel the entire length of the muscle fiber. The action potential causing it to contract. Okay, this graph is the action potential graph. Okay, now down here at negative 70 millivolts, this is a resting membrane. This is just everything at rest. Okay, and when a stimulus comes in, it's going to start to excite it. So we're adding an electrical charge. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little bit of an exaggerated example. So please just understand it's just an analogy and an exaggerated analogy. Okay, and that will be a taser. The reason why I'm picking a taser is because it's an electrical device. Okay, when you push the button on a taser, you have now activated electricity. Now, just holding the taser, that's just potential energy right now. Nothing has really happened because it has not contacted anything. So if you go up to someone and take the taser and simply contact them, you're now transferring energy from this taser into the body. That transfer of energy we'll call the synapse. Now, yes, this is an aggressive example, but hopefully you're getting a visual of what's happening with electricity. So as you're transferring energy from the device into the body, the muscles are going to respond. Now, because of the high voltage, you get massive shakes, okay? Now, in your body, it's regulated different. So instead of measuring it in volts, which those tasers are like, 50,000, 100,000 volts, this is negative 70 millivolts. So it's not a lot of juice or electricity, but it's still measurable. So negative 70 millivolts. Okay, so now you're coming in with your taser, so to speak, and it's emitting a spark. And right now this spark is at 70 millivolts, so just enough to give it a resting membrane potential. Okay, now you've increased the voltage, which has now moved it up to negative 55 millivolts, and now you've increased it even more. And once it hits this threshold of negative 55 millivolts, or enough juice, now you're going to get this action potential. Okay, you're going to get depolarization followed by repolarization with a little bit of a refractory period, and then it's going to be eligible to do it again. Okay, now this is a time to write down some keywords here. Depolarization versus repolarization. Okay, now at rest, a cell has a higher concentration of potassium on the inside. Okay, now potassium is K on the periodic table. And it has a higher concentration of sodium on the outside. Now what this has done is it has created more positive charges on the outside and more negative charges on the inside. And they're separated by the cell membrane, so they're not actually going to touch. Now keep in mind, positive and negative charges attract, like charges repel. So this is potential energy right here. Okay, these two forces want to bind or stick together. As you can imagine, if I gave you a positive and a negative magnet and you put them together, at some point they just stick. Okay, and you can feel that. And the more powerful the magnet, the more powerful you feel that force. Okay, now that's at rest. Once negative 55 millivolts has hit, now we have, we'll just say, movement. So now the cell, that potassium that was on the inside leaves, and the sodium that was on the outside rushes in. Okay. Now go back to that synaptic cleft and the axon terminal. When acetylcholine is released and hits the postsynaptic membrane, you've opened up these channels, and sodium rushes in, potassium leaves. 3 sodium rush in, 2 potassium leave. The video will show you that. This is called depolarization, and in lay terms for now we'll just say the contraction phase. When something depolarizes, it is now contracting. Once the contraction takes place and goes all the way up to about positive 30 millivolts, then it is time for it to reset. Okay, now that is now the repolarization phase, where things are going to go back to where they came from, which is the rest position, which means potassium leaves the outside of the cell, extracellular, and goes to the inside. Okay, potassium leaves extracellular area and goes back to the inside, and sodium leaves and goes back to the outside. Okay, so everything switches. It goes back to the resting phase. That's repolarization. And now we're declining in millivolts. We dip down to the refractory period, and then it goes back to -70, which is the threshold. Okay, it is an all or none phenomenon, and once it happens, it happens. Depolarization followed by repolarization, and then the quick refractory period, and then the resting membrane. It's ready to go again. Okay, when all the cell muscles react to the stimulus, it's called a graded response. Okay, a graded response is simply the ability to respond to the electricity coming in, and when it's enough juice, boom, your depolarization takes place. Okay, the graded response of a muscle contraction occurs in two ways: by changing the frequency or the speed of the stimulation, and by changing the strength of the stimulation, which means the number of muscle cells that you're recruiting. So let's go back to our pencil analogy versus the 200-pound squat rack. If you simply pick up a pencil off the table, it really didn't need a lot of force, a lot of muscle recruitment, just enough to do it. Now think about this. If you use that exact same force to pick up a pencil, to pick up a 45-pound weight, it's not going to happen because you haven't recruited enough muscles to do so. So you just simply start recruiting more muscles to pick up that 45-pound, or what I have written here, 30-pound weight. Okay, so you're doing this by changing the speed of the stimulation and the strength of the stimulus. Alright, now when the muscle is in tectonic contraction, it's when the sum of the contraction of the muscles gets stronger and smoother. It's all summed together. It builds and builds and builds until it reaches complete tetanus or tectonic contraction. Now, don't confuse this with the disease tetanus. Okay, that's a different mechanism. This is a more physiology thing of tectonic contraction, or the sum of the graded response and everything together, allowing the muscle to contract and pick up whatever it is you're trying to pick up or move. The tetanus, also known as lockjaw, is a bacterium that causes it, and so that's different, okay, than the tectonic contraction.